Story 1. The Greyhound Bus. Amarillo to Oklahoma City. It should have been a simple trip, not more than 5 hours. I'm sure the driver of the Greyhound assumed that, which is a prime example of why you shouldn't make assumptions. The bus left the Amarillo Greyhound station at 5:47 a.m., March 11, 2018, and was due to arrive in Oklahoma City around 11 o'clock. When 11 o'clock came and went with no sign of the bus, the dispatcher hailed the driver to find out why he was late. No response. They were unable to pick it up on GPS either. In response, the Oklahoma Highway Patrol and the Texas Highway Patrol were notified. A search was organized, covering the entire route the bus was supposed to take. After 3 days, there was no sign of the bus, or its 37 occupants. Highway Patrol continued searching for a month, but they found nothing. Eventually they called off the search, the families of the passengers continued to mourn, and the news stopped talking about it. Until 5 days ago, when it showed back up. It was found and reported parked on the side of the highway about 30 miles outside Oklahoma City, in an area that I know for a fact had been searched. When state troopers arrived on scene, they were unable to open the door on the bus. It had been fused shut, so they had to cut their way in. When they did, they found the driver and all 36 passengers dead. Most of them were piled up by the door, like they'd been trying to get off. A few were laying by the emergency exit, which was similarly fused. None of them had any stab or gunshot wounds, so the cause of death wasn't readily apparent. All the bodies were loaded up and sent to the office of the chief medical examiner in Oklahoma City, which is where I enter the picture. Despite them being missing for almost 3 months, lividity and body temperature showed that none of them had been dead for more than a few hours. I performed autopsies on 3 of the corpses, and the conditions they were in goes against everything I learned in medical school. The first body I examined was of a 21-year-old male named Brendan Ayers, a student of Amarillo College. He was heading to Oklahoma City to visit family on spring break. Cyanosis on his face, as well as petechial hemorrhages in both of his eyes, indicated suffocation. There was no evidence of strangulation though, no ligature marks or skin under his fingernails, which would show he fought back. The time came to open his chest and examine his organs, at which point the cause of death became obvious. His lungs were too small. I don't mean they were deflated, I mean they were the size of a 5-year-old's lungs. Analysis of a tissue sample showed the DNA didn't match Brendan's, it matched another bus victim, who just so happened to be a 5-year-old boy, and guess what? His autopsy showed that his lungs were massively oversized. My second corpse was a 16-year-old female named Brittany McCormick, who was traveling with her mother to visit her dad stationed at Vance Air Force Base. No signs of harm on the surface. Examination of her abdominal organs revealed nothing out of place. It wasn't until I opened her skull that I found the cause of death. Her brain was gone. The cranial cavity was empty, yet there were no cuts in the bone before I opened it. The third and final corpse I autopsied was of a 36-year-old female named Danielle Lawson. Like Brendan, she had the typical signs of suffocation. Other than that, the only abnormality I noticed was that all of her teeth were gone. It wasn't like they'd been pulled, it was like they'd never been there to begin with. Her gums were smooth, with none of the sockets you see after an extraction. Once again I opened the chest to view the lungs, and saw multiple perforations. Feeling the lungs, I could feel solid objects inside, which had caused a traumatic pneumothorax. I guess she tried to cough them up, and that had torn her esophagus. I then opened the lungs to remove the objects, and at the same time I found her missing teeth. I was supposed to examine 4 more, but then they arrived. Dozens of soldiers in NBC suits, they showed up in big armored vehicles with biohazard symbols on them. Sweeping through the building, they collected all the bodies, as well as all the samples we'd taken. Then they made us hand over all notes and recordings, and delete any data concerning the case from our computer system. The things that happened to those people on the bus are things that can't happen. Now, I don't know who the men were that took the bodies, or why, but I know it isn't right. The families deserve to know the truth. And I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Story 2. At 3:17 a.m., a bus that isn't on the schedule arrives outside my house. For context, I am a middle-aged man who lives on the outskirts of Parbold, a small English village. My house is the only one on a long, winding, country road, but it does have a bus stop. From my bedroom window, I can see it on the other side of the road. It's quite handy, really. I never miss the morning bus to work, and I know the schedule off by heart. That's why I was bewildered when I first noticed the 3:17 a.m. bus on Saturday, October 14th. It woke me up, actually. I'm a light sleeper. I sat upright in my bed, twisted my body around, propped myself up on my knees, and gingerly inched the curtains open. The old lamppost on my road illuminated an ominous, fully gray, non-branded, single-decker bus. There was no interior lighting. I couldn't see a driver or any passengers. Now, this was obviously bizarre. Buses don't show up at that time in the morning. Not in this country. Not in any town or city I know, anyway. Still, I assumed, as any person would, that times were changing. It seemed like a good idea. A bus for those who've missed the last train home after a night out, perhaps. That still didn't entirely make sense because very few people use my bus stop. It's a 10-minute walk from here to anywhere. I checked the schedule. Nothing. There was a bus at 11:07 p.m. on Friday evening, and there shouldn't have been another one until 6:05 a.m. on Saturday morning. I watched the vehicle pull away and considered, perhaps, that it wasn't a public bus. Maybe it was a hired coach. That seemed like a reasonable explanation. I put it out of my mind and went back to sleep. However, it returned the next morning. And it continued to do so for weeks. Again, I checked the schedule. Still no mention of a 3:17 a.m. bus. I called the council, and they assured me that it wasn't a public bus. They said that I could contact the local authorities to report any suspicious activity. So, I rang the police. They didn't care. They passed me over to some civil department with a forgettable name, and that department passed me over to another department. Nobody was concerned. It became clear that each person I contacted just wanted me to tire of the whole thing and stop bothering them. I gave up on seeking help, but I didn't give up on my quest for an answer. I started making notes. The bus always arrived at exactly 3:17 a.m. It would linger for approximately 30 seconds. Nobody ever boarded or departed the vehicle. I took a picture of it and posted it on various forums. Nobody could identify the origin of the faceless gray bus, but one comment did stand out. I remember a user telling me that I should sell my house and move. They said that the bus was there for me. Most importantly, they said that I shouldn't, under any circumstances, board it. That seemed like a rather obvious piece of advice. I wasn't planning on boarding a sketchy, unlisted bus in the pitch-black hours of the morning. But everything changed on November 20th. The bus arrived on time. 3:17 a.m., I knelt on my bed and peeked at it through the curtain as it rounded the corner. Something was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Once the vehicle had rolled to a complete stop, I heard it. Somebody on the bus was screaming. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Silence followed, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew I'd heard that scream. I watched the bus and waited. 30 seconds passed. A lot of time passed. When I finally peeled my eyes from the road to check my phone, it was 3:29 a.m. The bus hadn't moved. The world outside was still eerily quiet. I reattached myself to reality and started dialing 999. The call kept failing, and then I saw that I had no signal. None. I usually had signal at the house. I was freaking out, so I got up to turn on my bedroom light. Nothing. I flicked the switch back and forth. No power. The story was the same throughout the house. I was about to head to the fuse box, but I looked out of my living room window to see a blackened world. The lamppost was dead. It had to be a power cut. That was when I finally understood, for the first time in my 10 years of solitary living, that I was truly isolated. I had no neighbors, no friends, no family. I was all alone. The gravity of the situation dawned on me. I would have to leave the house. My self-preservation instinct was to stay indoors, but I couldn't ignore the disembodied scream that had echoed through the night. I knew it had come from the bus. I knew I couldn't live with myself if I were to dismiss it. Armed with a winter coat and a wind-up torch, I bravely ventured into the night, locking my door behind me. I tentatively strolled down my front path, stopping at the gate to cast the torchlight onto the other side of the road. It revealed the gray, stationary, seemingly abandoned bus. There were no signs of life. Everything was so quiet. I swore to myself that I could hear my heartbeat in my eardrums. I swung the creaky gate open and began to cross the road, futilely attempting to steady my quaking knees. My torch wobbled in my shaky left hand, so I clasped my wrist with my right hand. I shone the light into the windows of the parked vehicle. There was definitely no driver, but it was an elevated coach, so I couldn't see whether there were any passengers. I walked around the front of the vehicle, summoning the courage to enter it. When I reached the other side of the bus, I stood still. I tried to control my breathing. I eyed the doors for what seemed an eternity, and then I felt my entire body clench. The doors opened. My torchlight still wasn't revealing a driver. I couldn't see or hear anyone. I thought, for a brief moment, of that internet stranger who told me not to board the bus, but I couldn't get the scream out of my head. My gut told me that somebody was in danger. I stepped onto the bus and started to climb the stairs. The doors closed. I held the torch before me, as if it were a weapon, and I gradually climbed the next set of stairs to the elevated passenger platform. I spent several seconds on each step, savoring what I felt could be my final moments on Earth. Then, I illuminated the passenger area before me. I half expected to see nothing. No. There was somebody on the bus. The young girl was sitting on the middle seat of the back row. Her head was in her palms. She was crying. I couldn't see her face. "Are you okay?" I asked, timidly. No answer. So, I started to walk forwards. I didn't know whether there was anyone else on board, but I couldn't leave her. Once I was standing only a few yards in front of her, I knelt down in the aisle. "Are you okay?" I asked a second time. The girl's crying abruptly ceased, but she didn't lift her head from her hands. "You shouldn't have boarded the bus," she replied. My torch died. I furiously wound the lever at the side, but it didn't spring back to life. The girl and I had been plunged into darkness. Then, I heard the bus doors open. I slowly turned my head to face the front of the bus. I could hear the sound of low, guttural breathing. It was followed by clunking footsteps. Dim moonlight shone through the front window, but it was sufficient to display a hulking figure at the other end of the aisle. A black specter with gangly limbs was moving towards us. He hunched forwards, and his elongated arms dragged along the tops of the seats. He was too tall and too wide to fit in the aisle. I turned to face the girl. She had lifted her head from her hands. I could barely see her. I could barely hear her. "This is the last stop," she whispered. "I was really hoping you wouldn't board." I wanted more time. Before I could even comprehend what was happening, I felt an icy limb coil itself around my ankle. It yanked, and I fell. My nose connected with the floor of the aisle, and I heard something crack. I thought that was it. I thought that was the end, but I looked up to see the demonic creature coil its other limb around the girl's neck. It hoisted her from her seat. She screamed as she was lifted towards the indistinguishable figure in the aisle. I couldn't really see what happened in the darkness, but I'll never forget the sound her body made when it was consumed by the black entity. It sounded like leaves crunching beneath walking boots. I had almost entirely lost my sense of reality at this point, but some vestige of survival instinct persisted in my fractured mind. I twisted onto my back and looked down at my ankle. I couldn't really see what I was doing in the dark. I just knew I had to act. So, with my free foot, I stamped on the creature's limb. I stamped as hard as humanly possible. The demon, which had been devouring the poor girl, unleashed an inhuman wail. It pierced my eardrums and shattered every window on the bus. The limb retracted from my ankle and returned to the shadowy being. I seized my opportunity. Catapulting to my feet, I spun around and lunged for the now glassless back window of the bus. Clinging to the frame of the window for dear life, I took one last look at the dark entity that was hurtling towards me. Then, I dropped to my feet on the road. I sprinted away from the bus. Adrenaline fueled me onwards. I didn't look back. I just kept running. At the speed I traveled, I think it only took me a few minutes to reach the warm and welcoming lights of civilization. I looked at my phone and cried when I saw that I had service. I booked a taxi. I wanted the farthest possible destination. I chose Manchester, then I took the first train to London. For the past couple of weeks, I've been living in a hotel. I know I was a little late, but I finally took the advice of that online stranger. I moved away. I moved far away. I don't go outside at night, and I definitely don't look out of the window after 3 a.m. Story 3. I took the wrong company bus to work. I think I fucked up. Let me give some context. My name is Alex. I am 23 years old and take public transport to work every day since I started my mundane, 9-to-5 desk job in Singapore, which meant public transport is generally affordable and frequent if not on time. I lived briefly in other countries where a bus comes every 30 minutes, so I think we are pretty fortunate in that regard. In addition to this, one bus stop usually has several different buses rather than just 2 or 3, so you can hop onto a different bus if you miss one. My usual routine consists of walking to the train station, take the train to an overly crowded station, and wait for the bus at the interchange. After about 2 months into the daily catch the bus routine, I noticed that certain companies have catered buses for their employees. For certain buses, the back door is always closed and the driver must verify the employee work pass before allowing them to board. These usually apply to banks and big corporations where several buses come within the span of an hour, and it still isn't enough to fit everyone. There are, however, other buses which belong to smaller companies. They are usually unmarked and identified through a simple piece of paper on the windscreen or only known to the employee of the company internally. These are the buses that do not need verification and people frequently enter through the back door. Knowing this, I started playing the pretend I belong game. I would hope on the buses on days where I am not scheduled to work and see where it goes. After a few trial and errors which led me to business districts and offices, I found 2 buses which goes to the district which I work in. It saves me roughly $50 a month on concession pass, which I am extremely thankful for. This became the norm for the following 4 months, but one day the bus which I usually hop on to hitch a ride to work did not arrive. Neither did I see the usual employees wearing the signature orange striped shirts. After a quick Google search, it seems like they have stopped the catered bus services due to a huge layoff and shit. Basically, running out of money and on the verge of closing the company. Well, like any other sane human being would, I sucked it up and took the normal, not free bus to work. By the following week, I had already spent more than $20 simply traveling without concession. The next Monday, I woke up earlier to skip the traffic and to make use of the policy, whereby if you take the train earlier than 7:30 a.m., the fees would be drastically lowered. Why I didn't buy the concession, I will never know. I guess I was just not prepared to blow $50 a month for it after all that free riding. In any case, I arrived earlier than I have ever been. The bus stop was surprisingly empty apart from a handful of people. As I resumed playing Arena of Valor on my phone, I noticed a sleek white bus arriving. Being both hopeful for a free ride and curious as to where it leads, I sneaked in through the back of the bus. I didn't notice then, but there was something off about the bus. Firstly, there were already people on the bus. Catered buses usually don't make stops, so it should have been empty. Secondly, no one got on the bus but me and another child who was too young to be taking catered buses. Unless this was a school bus, but the passengers all seemed to be of a very different age. The youngest was a baby, cradled by his or her mother, fast asleep. The oldest was full of wrinkles and I suspect could barely take a step without falling. In any case, I was early, so if the bus went somewhere else I could just take a bus to work from there instead. The problem is, I have been on the bus for close to 15 hours and it still has not stopped. Now I know what you must be thinking: why didn't you get off the bus when the traffic light was red and all that? Well, the bus doors were locked tight and the moment I got up of my seat, everyone, and I meant everyone, including the probably 3-month-old baby, stared at me with wide open eyes. Needless to say, I immediately sat the fuck down and kept my head low. The passengers continued to stare for a good 5 minutes before resuming starting into space. I guess I should have noticed another thing by now, and it's that nobody is using any form of mobile devices. They were all staring into space, solemn as if waiting for something to happen. I was sacred shitless and resolved to continue sitting there until the door opens or someone else gets up. After taking a close look at my surroundings, I realized it does not look like any part of Singapore that I know. For those who live here, and even those who don't, knows that this place is damn small. No, we are not in China, thank God for the summit. Yet, I had no idea where I was. Throughout all this, I kept trying to catch the attention of the bus driver but could not seem to make out his face. There seemed to be a dark shadow looming over him. The bus seemed to go on, to an underdeveloped area with wilting grass and barren lands. There were no other cars nor traffic light in the vicinity and my iPhone had no reception. Not awfully uncommon for a mobile provider, but the weirdness creeped me out more than pissing me off. It was 9 a.m. when I boarded, but in the 15 hours, the scenery gradually changed to that of an orange-white sunset glow. By now, I think both you and I understand this is not a normal bus anymore. But hey, paranormal things aren't real, and the bus eventually came to a stop. Something told me I shouldn't get off, so I stayed. The first stop was beside a river, reflecting the red and orange glow of the sunset. The children got off here, except for the baby and her mother. The next stop was in a quarry-like area. Adults and old people both left the bus. This left me with the mother and her baby in the bus, and eventually, she too alighted inside a bamboo forest, without her baby. The bus throttled on and on. The baby was surprisingly quiet, and deep down I prayed this was not the end of the line for me, and I would be able to get off the bus. We came to an empty place. It was white. It seemed like you were surrounded by walls, but that's not exactly true. It's simply that everything was white and no distance nor time could be told. The bus driver got up then and walked towards my direction at the back of the bus, and it was then I realized he had no face. It was a face where the skin would be, but without the eyes, the nose, and any facial feature. On his forehead, an eye opened in the middle where your normal eyes would be. He carried the baby and proceeded to leave the bus. Wait, I meekly called out, reluctant to be left alone here, possibly for forever. I got the same response back in return. In a soothingly handsome voice, if there's even such a thing, without turning back at me. I stayed there for what felt like hours, but probably 15 minutes. I saw him walk towards a white altar, left the baby there, and soon the baby was engulfed in a gentle, warm light which had an outline of a woman's hand. He returned to the bus then and started the bus. He seemed to sense my confusion and fear, only responding with "It's not your time yet," and continued driving into the brightest of light, so bright that it blinded me into the darkness. I awoke on a hospital bed. Apparently, I had collapsed as I was boarding the bus for work that day, and someone called the ambulance. I spent 3 days in a medically induced sleep while doctors figure out what happened and let me rest. I was discharged with no diagnosis except to take care of my diet and avoid getting up too fast. I have a sense of what happened that day, and I am thankful the one-eyed driver sent me back to where I belong. A part of me knows one day, I will be on that bus and I will meet him again. Story 4. Recently I had visited Beijing, and as usual had done my research of haunted spots. Since most of the spots seemed to be far away from the hotel I was staying at, I didn't plan on any ghost hunting activities. The tours I had signed up for were all starting the day after I landed, so after checking into my hotel I just went to Luhu Lake and decided to pass some time there for my first day. I sat at a bar and had beer, and started chatting with some locals and other travelers. After a few pints and the setting of the sun, I thought why not ask if anyone knew a ghost story to tell about Beijing. Everyone was friendly and open, as well as a bit tipsy, so the stories started to flow. One particular story was of a haunted bus route. It's an urban legend what was about a man getting on the last bus to go home, but that bus disappears and is found 3 days later with horribly decomposing bodies. It didn't seem like anyone knew why or how that had happened, since the bodies were way too decomposed for the short time that the bus was missing. The locals started arguing in Mandarin about the different versions, which I had no idea what they were saying. Then one of them angrily stated in English, "That bus is leaving in an hour from there, why don't you just go find out for yourself?" Now this had piqued my interest. Turns out the bus route they were talking about wasn't too far and was also going in the direction of my hotel. It was Faith. I collected more information, as well as a travel buddy. The man who had been challenged had actually taken it up, and we both decided let's check this out. To be honest, I was happy a local was with me, since I couldn't speak Mandarin at all. It would make the whole buying ticket process easier. By the end of it, I was very thankful he was with me. On this dark night and possibly stormy night, we had boarded the last bus heading to Beijing's Fragrant Hills, located in Haidian district. Shortly after, 2 men tried to wave the bus down. The bus driver was initially reluctant to pick the men up because they weren't waiting at a bus stop. Pretty sound logic if you ask us. However, the driver decided to stop after the conductor reminded him that it was the last bus. Once the mysterious roadside men were on board, passengers were surprised to see they were wearing some pretty badass Qing dynasty robes, and that there were actually 3 men, one with long messy hair, being supported by the 2 roadside creepers. The men's faces were much whiter than a normal person's, and they didn't interact with any of the passengers on the bus. Naturally, commuters were a bit uneasy with the whole situation, but the conductor cooled things over by telling them they were likely actors who had no time to change costumes before leaving work. Slowly the bus began to empty of passengers, until only an old lady and us had remained inside with the mystery men. All was quiet until the old woman abruptly accused me of stealing her wallet, a claim that resulted in an intense argument. Again, I was very thankful for the local Chinese man accompanying me, otherwise I would have understood a word she was saying. The quarrel was resolved when the old lady insisted we get off the bus and go to the nearest police station. Once off the bus, though we were very annoyed with the old woman, realizing we had just got off the possibly haunted last bus and that there was no police station in sight. We had missed the opportunity to possibly solve the old urban legend. Fortunately for us, the elderly woman picked up on something we had missed. The 3 robed men did not have legs and, by default, must have been ghosts. The wind coming in from the window raised their robes, and I saw they didn't have feet, the old lady told us. We might have owed this lady our lives. I don't really know what happened to the bus driver or conductor after we had jumped off, but I hope they made it back safely. To my peace of mind, there was nothing about the bus disappearing on the news the next day or anything. I wonder what would have happened if I were alone, didn't understand the old woman at all, and continued to stay on that bus. Story 5. The Late Night Trolley Bus. I am a university student living in Vilnius, Lithuania. Like many of my peers, I occasionally go to parties hosted by friends or fellow students. But after yesterday's night, I don't think I'll ever go to a party again. The night started off well. My university classmate, who lived with his parents instead of the dorm, called me and said his folks weren't home, so he was planning on hosting a party. Of course, I accepted his invite and set out to the party on trolleybus route 2. This route is one of the longest in the city, running from the university dorm village to the railway station in the south of town. It took me some 20 minutes to get to my friend's place. The party was wonderful. We told jokes, flirted with girls, drank a couple beers and played video games on my pal's PS5. Eventually, however, we were all tired and people began to go home. I looked at my phone, which said the time was 0:30. I said goodbye to my friend and left his apartment. I walked to the bus stop, but the timetable said the last trolleybus 2 had left an hour ago. I figured I would have to call a taxi. But as I pulled out my phone, I heard something. It was the unmistakable sound of a trolleybus approaching. That's weird, I thought. Trolleybuses never ran this late, not even on New Year's. The sound got closer and closer. Soon, the trolleybus was in sight. It was an older model, a Skoda 14TR, with the number 2 sign in the front window. I watched as the vehicle stopped and opened its doors. Figuring that it was probably delayed, I climbed on board. Looking around, I realized I was the only passenger in the trolleybus. After all, it was midnight, so everyone was already asleep by this time. I punched my ticket and sat down on one of the seats. The doors closed and the trolleybus began moving again. I drowsily looked out the window as shops and streetlights flew by. Occasionally, the trolleybus would stop, but no one ever got on. As I approached the dorm village, I noticed something. The trolleybus wasn't stopping anymore. I looked at the driver's reflection in the front window, but he was just sitting there, hands firmly on the wheel. Looking at him for 30 seconds, I realized he didn't blink even once. Strange, I thought. I would have fallen asleep behind the wheel if I was in his place. As the last stop approached, I stood up and walked to the door, expecting the driver to stop and open it. He didn't. He just kept staring at the road in front and driving on, passing the last stop. Only thing is, I was sure the overhead lines ended there and didn't go any further. Hey! Stop the bus, I want to get off. I said it loud enough for the driver to hear me, but the guy didn't even flinch. At this point, I was starting to panic. Now, one thing our city's public transport has in common are hammers located above the windows. They can be used to smash the window in case of emergency. I looked around for one, but the only hammer in the entire trolleybus was above the door closest to the driver. Fuck this, I thought. No way am I going to approach that freak. I then noticed that the middle door was a bit loose, and then it hit me. This was it, my only chance to escape. I ran down to the door and kicked it. It budged a bit, but didn't open, so I tried again. Then, I heard it. The driver was maniacally laughing at the wheel. Panicking, I kicked one last time and the door flung open. Not hesitating for a moment, I jumped clear and landed in some bushes. Apart from some bruises, I wasn't injured too badly. I looked at the road in front to see the rear lights of the trolleybus disappearing in the distance. I had to walk 10 houses back until I got to my dorm. I took a quick shower and went to sleep. Obviously, after such a ride, I didn't sleep well. The next day, I went to the bus stop and saw that the wires did indeed end there. It was impossible for a trolleybus to move without being attached to the wires, I knew that much. I'm posting this as a warning to others. If you're ever in Vilnius late at night and see a trolleybus driving slowly down the road after hours, do not board it. Don't even go near it and call a cab instead. Otherwise, you might be taken to God knows where. Story 6. Bus 221. 2 years ago, after being out of the province for most of my youth, I decided it was time to move back to my hometown. Having been away for so long, I was more than a bit anxious at the prospect of return. Most of my friends I had grown up with were doing quite well. My mother took any opportunity she could to tell me the latest news that she'd heard of them. I'm not sure if she did this on purpose, but it definitely made me realize I hadn't exactly been living up to any sort of expectations. I would be returning penniless, and to make things worse, I'd be staying at my parents' until I got on my own 2 feet. At the age of 27, I felt like my youth had faded, and all of a sudden I had failed at adult life. Where my friends had sought out steady employment and stability, I had issues staying in one place for too long. I often sought adventure and excitement away from the usual social conventions. While my friends had worked hard, starting families, buying houses and cars, I had spent most of my time hitchhiking and bumming around, collecting social assistance between infrequent bouts of short-term work. It's not that I was lazy. Like I said, I spent a lot of time doing different things. I just had a hard time staying put. Though I guess after some time the weight of my choices was too much and I had caved, because here I was 10:30 at night, halfway across the country with my ticket in hand, purchased with my emergency funds, waiting for the Greyhound that was now about 15 minutes late that was scheduled to take me back home. The usual assortment of bus jockeys were seated around the station, mostly younger people. Scanning the station's seating, I eyed over my fellow passengers, some who might be going as far or further than me, and I would probably form some kind of gritty traveler's bond with over the next several days. Suddenly, from a speaker on the wall, a crackly voice announced, "Due to unforeseen technical difficulties, eastbound 221 will be delayed until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." The room erupted with a low grumbling. Shit, I thought out loud, now what? A small lineup had begun to form at the ticket counter window. A tired-looking older woman at the desk was explaining to another customer that the terms and conditions of the ticket allowed for time adjustment and that there were no refunds available. I knew my time waiting in line would be wasted, so I sprawled out on the bench instead, figuring noon could say too much if I crashed in the bus station. After all, I had nowhere else to go, and I didn't feel like setting up camp somewhere and risk missing such an early bus. The line eventually dissipated and most of the crowd shuffled out, resigning the inevitable wait until tomorrow morning. I wasn't really tired. I had, as mentioned earlier, a lot on my mind, and this delay, while annoying, was sort of welcome as it meant delaying my return home, even if only by half a day. At 11 o'clock the lights in the station dimmed, and the shutters were pulled down over the window at the ticket desk. The station had gone quiet, the only sounds being the humming of the fluorescent lighting. I opened my bag. Digging around inside, I retrieved my book and my sleeping bag, figuring I could at least get comfortable and catch up on some reading. I started really sinking into my book, and after a long time my eyelids started to feel weighed down. Maybe I'd get some sleep after all. This idea was quickly pushed from my mind as an employee's only door opened at the other end of the room and a janitor came striding in with a large industrial floor cleaner. He noticed me and gave me a meager nod, then proceeded to plug the machine into a wall and start it up. I've always been something of a light sleeper, and this noisy piece of equipment would be enough to keep me awake, so I decided that I'd step out and get some air. I knew my backpack and things would be safe if I left them for a bit, only the janitor was there and the bus stop had lots of cameras anyways. So I got up and walked to the front of the station and pushed against the heavy exit door. Immediately I was greeted by a blast of cool night air that I welcomed with a deep inhale. The bus station was on the edge of town. There wasn't much around except for an old diner across the road which was closed. Walking around to the side of the station, I realized I wasn't as alone as I had thought, as another bus had arrived. It must have pulled in while I was reading, I thought. The lights inside the bus were on and the passengers inside mostly seemed to be sleeping. They'd probably unload in a few minutes. Some of them may even be waiting for tomorrow's bus, and maybe I'd have someone to chat with, which wouldn't be so bad, as sitting alone in the bus station at night was getting a bit lonely. I mean, sure, there was the janitor inside, but he was busy working diligently to make sure that I couldn't catch any sleep. Looking more closely at the bus, I noticed at least one passenger was awake, sitting up in the back of the bus. In fact, they seemed to be trying to get my attention by waving at me. Sheepishly, I waved back. I wasn't sure who this person was, and I can be a bit awkward at times. I turned around to look in the station window, hoping to see the big clock on the wall. Inside, the janitor was still working busily. I could still hear the floor polisher running faintly from here. The clock said it was just after 3:30. Damn, I must have been reading a lot longer than I thought. I realized. I looked back to the bus to see if it had begun to unload yet, and saw that the figure at the back was still waving at me, though faster now, almost with a sense of urgency. A little unsure, I took a look around to make sure I wasn't mistaken, and they were instead waving to someone they knew. No, I was definitely alone. The parking lot, minus this bus, was completely empty. Cautiously, I approached the bus with the waving person. I wasn't sure what it was, but I was feeling a weary vibe deep in my gut, and something I'd learned in my years of hitchhiking adventure was to trust that deep internal feeling. As I got nearer, I realized the person, a younger boy. He couldn't have been more than 10, with a dark bowl haircut and huge dark eyes. Though he wasn't waving at all, but actually seemed to be banging frantically on the window, a look of terror on his face. A deep chill ran up my back and I turned around again, scanning the parking lot, still completely empty. Not only empty, but also quiet. I hadn't realized until now just how quiet it was out here. No cars on the nearby freeway. Something was missing. I couldn't hear the janitor working anymore. No, that wasn't it. I couldn't hear the boy banging on the window glass. I turned back around. The boy looked to be banging harder than ever against the window and even appeared to be trying to yell something to me, yet I couldn't hear him. The other passengers in their seats all seemed to be deep asleep. No one was paying this kid any attention. I ran to the front of the bus. Why was no one else helping this kid? What was going on? Why was everyone else sleeping? Something was wrong, very wrong. I got to the door at the front of the bus, but it wouldn't budge. I banged on the door though I received no response. Putting my hand over my eyes to peer in through the tinted glass door, I could see the driver. He was sitting upright with the same look in his eyes as the boy, gripping at the steering wheel with both hands. I banged on the door again though he didn't seem to even notice me. I ran back to the side of the bus where I saw the boy, though he wasn't in his seat anymore. In fact, none of the passengers who were sleeping a minute ago or the boy were anywhere to be seen. Momentarily frozen in place, I looked the bus over thoroughly from front to back. No one was on board. What the hell was going on? After a minute, I found my legs again. Though they felt a lot like jelly, I was able to start slowly backing away from the bus. What was going on with me? What had happened? Was I losing my mind, or having some kind of sleep-deprived mental breakdown? I looked back to where the kid had been, thinking it must be some kind of trick, though there was nothing, no boy, no movement. Then I saw it, bus 221. This was the bus I was supposed to be on. The one that had some kind of technical difficulty. I ran back to the bus station and went back in. The old janitor looked like he had just finished up and was unplugging his floor cleaner. I approached him and asked if he knew what was going on with bus 221. Not sure why they delayed it until tomorrow morning. Is everything okay with it? I asked, purposely leaving out the bit with the disappearing people. I didn't really believe what happened myself, and I didn't know this guy, so I wasn't going to make myself sound insane. Such a tragedy with that bus, he said somberly. Seems like only one survived, though it doesn't look good for him. I stared blankly in horror and confusion as what was being said dawned on me. He must have seen it on my face and continued, I guess you didn't know, huh? No, I guess they wouldn't have told everyone here until they were ready with some kind of statement. The local news station's been covering it on TV. I was watching it a bit in the back. They had kid in critical condition last I saw. Just a kid. Tragic. They said he was covered in burns, but he was being airlifted to the hospital. What kind of life can he expect to have like that? Seems the driver drove off the guardrails on the highway into oncoming traffic and they caused a huge pileup. After being hit head-on by a transport truck, they ended up rolling and catching fire, killing almost everyone. They say alcohol looked to be involved. What a damn shame. I didn't say a word about what I saw to anyone. How could I? When I finally worked up the nerve to look the window, bus 221 was nowhere to be seen.